Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia Hall, and I'm today's moderator for the Meet a Poet series. We're closing out the 2025 season with a wonderful poet. Sorry, I was just getting some feedback. I'm a poet myself. I'm from Washington, D.C., and where I served as the Youth Poet Laureate in 2023. I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania, where I study English and creative writing, and one of the poets I'm about to introduce is someone I've worked with closely over the past few years as the Youth Poet Laureate with these collections from 16 Rivers Press, where he's the editor. About the poet, Murray Silverstein recently released Red Studio in 2024, which is his third book of poems from 16 Rivers Press. His first collection, Any Old Wolf, received the Independent Publishers Bronze Medal for Poetry and was followed by Master of Leaves in 2014. His poems have appeared in Rattle, the Brooklyn Review, West Marin Review, Plainsongs, among other journals. He's a senior editor for 16 Rivers anthologies, America, We Call Your Name, Poems of Resistance and Resilience, which received the Independent Publishers Silver Medal for anthologies, and The Place That Inhabits Us, Poems of the San Francisco Bay Watershed. He also directs the 16 Rivers Press Youth Poetry Project, which has published 3 chapbooks. He's a practicing architect for 40 years and a co-author of 4 books on architecture. I'm overwhelmed with joy to introduce Murray to today's series. I can't wait to hear his poems aloud. Thank you, Murray, for joining us. We're going to have a brief Q&A after his reading, so feel free to put any questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, and welcome everybody. This is an unusual experience for me. I'm in Oakland, California, which is the eastern side of the San Francisco Bay. So it's almost 7 a.m. in the morning here. So the idea of getting out of bed and reading to folks in Russia is quite thrilling and novel to me. I wanted to begin today with a poem, with some words from a poem by the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska. These words served as an epigram to my latest book of poetry, Red Studio, that Sophia mentioned. Epigram being those words at the front of the book that try to express something of the theme or background for what's to come. So these are words from Szymborska. What sort of thing is poetry? Many a shaky answer has been given to this question. But I don't know. And I don't know and hold on to it as to a saving banister. And that comes from a longer poem of hers, but I'm a poet who came to poetry late in my 50s. I was an architect professionally for most of my life, and I was always reading poetry, but I began to write it seriously in my 50s. And not only is there the advancing age that makes you need that saving banister physically, but there's also that way in which poetry has become for me, metaphorically, the kind of banister, something I hold on to, trying to express things in language, trying to find a certain music in language, which helps me to understand I'll call them my late years. I'm 82 now. The first poem I want to start with is called In the Matter of Paternity, which might seem like something of a legal phrase. Who's the father here? Might be another way to say it. In the matter of paternity, I'm the son of not knowing and wanting, and the father of the dream of my father, the son of the cellist playing Bach for cash that cold December night at the train station, and the father of my need for him. I was born to be an answer to the question of my father, child of a seamstress and tailor from Minsk. It's all spelled out in the stars. The Father pouring darkness on the fire of the sun is the Son whose Father is fanning the flame. Partly I wanted to start with that because of its mention of Minsk. My father's side of my family, I was raised in Los Angeles, California, West Coast, not far from where I live now. But my father's side of the family all were Jews immigrating from Eastern Europe, Russia, Lithuania, Poland, possibly Minsk. And so I thought that might be of interest. It's a family story that immigrants came to the United States in the 1880s, 90s, or turn of the century. And then a certain population of those folks moved around the country trying to find the right conditions, eventually ending up in Los Angeles. That's where I was born in 1943. The next poem is called Stardust, and let me say that title is a song, an American songbook written in the 1920s. It's a song that became the most popular song of my father's generation. It was kind of the anthem of his generation. I heard it all the time as a kid. But this is a poem written for my grandchildren who were asking me, I have 4 grandkids, they're asking me to tell them something about, in a poem, about my father's backstory, which I knew very little. There was as was often the case, very little was said about the stories of immigration that were handed down. So what I do know is chronicled here in this poem called Stardust for the grandkids. So if you'll imagine yourself as one of my grandchildren, that will help. Stardust, night, and your great-great-great-grandfather, Murray Silverstein, drafted by the Tsar and ordered to ransack the shtetl next door, leaves the family in Bialystok, walks to a port in Germany, cons his way on a steamer, sails to England and then New York, where he hops a train to Chicago. His sister's already there, picks rags and learns to sew, saves and sends for Sarah, your great-great-great-grandmother, and 4-year-old Morris, my Grandpa Mo. Come to Chicago. All of it impossible. Every stitch. But Boonham can sew, Sarah and Boonham, and here come the girls, grand aunts Rosie and Sadie, Mamie and Kate. And Kate is where this is going. Your great-great-grand aunt Kate, who zigzags her way to LA, where she sings and plays piano at the Kit Kat Club. It's impossible, I know. But she's closing her set with Stardust tonight. That's me at the bar. And this one's for you. She's saying to me and to you. It steals across the meadows of my heart. That last line, it steals across the meadows of my heart, is one of the opening lines of the Stardust song. And let's see, anything else about that poem of interest? Well, it's the movement from, in this case, Eastern Poland to Chicago, to St. Louis, to Missouri, and then finally to Los Angeles. Here's a poem. It's called Los Angeles 1950. And it begins with a line from a poet, a quote from the Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz. The poem is called Los Angeles 1950, and the quote is, a poet must write in the language of his childhood. I heard that in an interview that Miłosz was giving. He was a poet that himself ended up in the Bay Area. He taught at the University of California, Berkeley, for many years. Ended up speaking English, of course, but continued to write in Polish. And he was asked by an interviewer why, if with such a command of the English language, he continued to write his poetry in Polish, a language that in the community he lived in, no one could understand. And he said, a poet must write in the language of his childhood. So this poem is me trying to recollect something from my childhood in 1950. It was a very moving moment for me. I was being raised in West Los Angeles. My father belonged to a temple, which I attended Sunday school. There was a moment when we were building a new temple, and we had to carry the Torah, the holy book of the Jews, across the town, down the street, and into the new building. The new building was, I'm 7 years old, and I knew that something terrible had happened in Europe, the World War II years. I didn't know specifically what. It took a long time before that news became clear to folks. But there was something that occurred to me as being safe about this new temple we were moving into. And my mother was raised Christian, so I have this duality to my backstory of partly Jewish and partly Christian. So you'll hear that in both the use of the word Torah and the books of the Hebrew Bible, and the words from the song Silent Night, which is a Christian Christmas song. Los Angeles, 1950, a poet must write in the language of his childhood. We were a crowd in the street, marching our Torah to its brand new home, cars honking, out of the way. I'm the boy behind the rabbi, humming Silent Night, the holiest thing I knew. All is calm, all is bright. Silence was God, but so is song, a rebel God. Silent too, the voice of my sister, lost, I'd been told, before I was born. Before you were born, my older sister said, her death became your soul. Soul, sister death, my becoming's angel, marching with me in the street to give our Holocaust Torah a safe new home. God wasn't dead, like the magazine said, but was death, singular. I am your shadow's shadow, my angel sister sang to me, to wash death clean, holy infant, so tender and mild, gathering each life in. I'm going to jump to another poem now. Again a memory of childhood, and this one needs a little bit of background. In most of my generation, and probably many earlier generations, if I were to stand up before an audience and say, "Please respond to the first line," Old MacDonald had a farm. Most everyone in the audience would sing back, E-I-E-I-O. It was a folk song that everybody learned as children. We all learned as children. It came from England and Scotland, I believe, into the United States, but it was across all subcultures. You learned Old MacDonald's farm. It was a kind of reverie of what farm life might have once been. And this poem, which is called Any Old Wolf, it was a title poem of my first collection, begins with a memory of what I was trying to understand about that E-I-E-I-O of the refrain of the song. I have a glass of water. It's just becoming dawn here. If the light changes in the room, it's because the foggy sun is coming through the window. Any old wolf, puzzled by all that E-I-E-I-O business on Old MacDonald's farm, I once thought vowels were feed, like hay and slop, and therefore the critters cried neigh or moo, oink or ba. They needed to be fed. They came with consonants like teeth, but vowels came from the man. And when night fell, wild ones crept around the barn to nab their share. That famous wolf in silhouette against the famous moon is howling back his vowels in praise. It's good to be among the fed. The sadness in his note is need. Ah, to need. He howls, but oh, to be well fed. He believes his W, his L, and F are mortal. But his O grew from a seed that fell once from the moon. I know, just any old wolf, but I eat of the I eternal, and so I at the oo, which also is eternal. I took in a tea from the teat of my ma, but hunt the great farm for my EIO. And that poem contains an idea which has become interesting to me, that the vowel sounds in languages contain something of the remnant of something of the eternal. That is, I often think that poetry has its roots in the kind of incantation that were the early religious songs and praise hymns, and that in that mixture of the everyday and the eternal, the vowels represent the eternal sounds, and the consonants that give the hard earthly sound to our language are the sounds of the everyday. So those are some poems that dealing with material from childhood. Let me jump ahead now, almost 70 years. Has anybody seen my dog? And this began when I saw a street artist in on the streets here in Oakland, California. He was a sculptor, and he was building animals of various sorts out of wire. And he was doing it right in front of everybody that passed him, and he was putting them up for sale for $1 each. And I stopped, and I was sort of stunned by them, and they were quite beautiful. And I was quite impressed. And this is called, Has Anybody Seen My Dog? I'm on my way to a play, and I see a guy in rags bending wire hangers into little animals. It's pretty elegant, actually. $1 each. Take a look, he says, holding up a dog. This one's my poetry dog. Eats garbage, shits diamonds. Oh, wow, I cried. That is my dog. But it's almost curtain time, and the tickets were pricey, so save me one, I say. I'll catch you coming out. But the play's experimental, goes on for 50 years. And when it's done, I'm 80. The guy, of course, long gone. I should have bought that dog, I think. But the play won a Tony, so I have that to tell. That, and that I'm sure that guy in rags was real. Someone's got that dog, I say to anyone who will listen. So there's a kind of surrealism element in that the play goes on for 80 years. The play wins an award, so you think, well, I have that to bank on. But I lost the moment as a young man when I could have had that dog, which does that amazing thing that everybody wants, eats shit and eats garbage and shits diamonds, which, by the way, is a quote from the German poet Goethe. And of course, the belief that poetry is being handed down generation to generation in an important way, and that oneself as a writer is simply helping to spin that wheel. Someone's got that dog, I say, to anyone who'll listen. And then another poem, a short one, which I'm calling adult fiction, which is again about this quality of having a childhood, particularly that time in childhood when you don't have language, which is the foundation of all of this, and you're beginning to learn language. What happens? How to understand what it was like to be human then, and then acquire language and have names for everything. Adult fiction. There is a book called The Child. Everyone has a copy, but it's never been read. You mean to find yours, sit down someday and give it a look. The blurbs say it's terrific. You laugh, you cry. A signed first edition. But where did you put it? Where did it go? So that's beginning to be the sort of laments of an older person, the late years poem, and that feeling of if the book must exist, if it could only be found and read. And along that theme, I've lived in the house that I'm sitting in now for, we moved in here in 1970 something. It was a house that was built after the great earthquake of San Francisco in 1906. So that's a house that's older than me by many years. This poem is called Old Man, Older House. And it's a poem that really springs entirely from my reading of an Irish poet that I love, Patrick Kavanagh. And I think it's one of the only times I've written a poem that's in a ballad form. That is, it's a very strict rhyming form, and it's got hard rhymes on the first and third lines, and the second and fourth lines. Old Man, Older House, after Patrick Kavanagh. We borrowed the dough to make the down. On this shingled house on Harwood, the dormer, the gate backed up to a creek, the rickety porch, the redwood. While scraping and painting, settling in, the kids were 1 and almost 4. Can I look around? I was born here. An old woman came to the door. Slowly she paced the rooms, the yard. Here were the chickens. Gertie, my hen. Till now it's me who names lost names. Jerry, the Stevens, the Colliers, Ben, until a world comes into view, complete with Nancy's cat and dog, and the god of imagination rising from an Oakland fog. Another poem which I'm going to continue with is that springs from the immigrant experience in America. The phrase, "So it wasn't the promised land." So it wasn't the promised land. Was a phrase that became something of an irony and ironic and a joke for folks who did immigrate here and found it not exactly everything they hoped it would be. So that's the title of this poem. So it wasn't the promised land, but there were trees, there was water, and there was Betty, that waitress that Dad called a flirt when she winked at me over pancakes. And there was, what's his name? Sanderson, yes, with the bouncing Adam's apple, who wrote on the blackboard, sorrow, sorrow. And don't try to understand, he said, just put it in your mouth. I did, and it tasted like music. I do, and it tastes like dirt. With the loamy, deep darkness of figs and the earth in a dream became one blue eye, staring alone into space, not the promised land, but there are stars. And I'll read a poem now, which is jumps into a completely different kind of tone. It's the title poem from the last book of my poetry. The title of the book is Red Studio. This poem is called The Red Studio, and it refers to a painting by the great French painter Henri Matisse, who the painting is called L'Atelier Rouge, the Red Studio. And it's a moment in Matisse's career, I think about midway through, where he backs up from the work he's been doing and he paints the studio in which he's been working. He's trying to see the space in which he has been doing the work of the last 20 years. And it's a large painting. It's 10 by 10. If you walk up close to it, you feel like you're engulfed by the painting. You have to stand back 20, 30 yards to see it as a room. And the strange thing about the painting is apparently it was quite well depicting of the space of the room three-dimensionally as it was being developed. But towards the very end of the painting, in a very Matisse-like way, he began to wash the canvas with red, with a dark red color that blotted out some of the perspective lines and made it seem like this. It was an interaction between the feeling created by this red paint and all the things he was depicting that were going on inside the studio, which of course were finished paintings, unfinished paintings, the coffee cup, the cat, and so on. So I was intrigued by this because starting poetry as late as I was interested in the space, and as an architect, of course, that was created by doing this kind of work in your life. And I was trying to back up and look at that kind of space. So this is called the Red Studio, honoring the painter Henri Matisse. In L'Atelier Rouge, a painting of Matisse's studio, in which he paints his paintings hanging from the walls, the cat on the floor of the painting is not a painting of a painting, nor, when I look carefully, is it a cat. It's a painting of a hand-painted plate. My head begins to spin, and I look at the goblet beside the plate, which looks to be outlined in white, but it's inlined, really. What appears to be outlined, only the canvas beneath. That is so cool, I think, lifting it to my lips. But it's empty of all but color, the astonishing, blinding red that all but devours the room. It's mystifying, terrifying even, learning to give and receive love. The color, surrounding the man with his hand in his head, the woman reclining alone. He was nearly done, they tell us, with L'Atelier Rouge, when without thinking he let loose the red, one big manic swing, a man reaching out and in, for where there is no more, more. Oh, happy accident from which all our bright unhappiness flows. I want to read a couple of poems about on their landmark dates in my marriage. I've been married to the same woman for over 50 years. We actually met 60 years ago, plus. And what happens to relationship, to feeling, to love in old age is what, of course, I've been experiencing and have been trying to capture in poetry occasionally. And this was a short poem. It's called Coral. Coral, that skeletal-like frames that evolve deep in the ocean. And it's choral written for our 50th anniversary. And I believe from what I had read in a book, I mean, a question that has come up among scientists is why does coral have such astonishing color? And apparently the deeper you find it in the ocean, the more brilliant the color can be. Why that would be the case has been a puzzle. And a woman scientist that I was reading was offering an explanation, and that became the basis for this poem. So it's a kind of metaphor. Coral, for our 50th anniversary. Some sun reaches the deeper you go, but only the weakest spectral blue. So it takes 1 billion years. But coral gives shelter to algae, while algae makes protein for coral from light. That protein, which makes the skeletons glow, all those oranges, yellows, and brilliant reds. Each feeds each. What light there is, the deeper you go. And it takes time, but everything's finally on fire. Well, an interesting experience for me writing poetry these years is writing things that I don't entirely understand, but which the music, the feeling of seems right. That seems to be a deeper feeling than the question of whether it makes complete sense. So for an example of that is in this last line. The deeper you go, and it takes time, but everything's finally on fire. What is that fire that I'm referring to there, and by analogy or metaphor, is the fire that the poem is speaking of? I don't entirely know, because many fires have gone out in life as you get older. But there seems to be some compensatory experience of heat, flame, power that still exists. And another poem about that same subject. I was reading this poem in a cafe in San Francisco, and I realized on when I got up to read it, I realized it was the exact date. It was the 60th anniversary of the date in which I had met my wife. We had met unusually in a resistance sit-in on the Cal campus, the University of California campus. We were students, and we got arrested together. And that was the beginning of our relationship. It was a resistance movement that grew out of the civil rights struggles in the South that had been moving around the country to gain full equal rights and voting rights, particularly to Black citizens. That's all backstory. This is simply a poem trying to speak, realizing that when I got up to read this, that it was the 60th anniversary of that date. Late love. And the first word in this poem is morning. Well, there's two uses of the word morning in the first line. And the first is they sound the same. And the first is M-O-U-R-N, mourning, which is lamenting, grieving. And the second one is morning. It's as it is right now. You can see the light coming on. Morning and morning. Late love for Marcia on the 60th anniversary of our being arrested together. Mourning for what you've yet to lose. You in my arms this morning. It makes no sense. Preemptive grieving? This, though, the sorrow note before it's played, you can feel the minor chord coming, a grief inside the joy. Late love, whose ivory crown is laughter. To have met at the well of laughter. To meet at the well of laughter. Laughter and forgetting. let's see how the time is doing here. Okay. Let me return to the beginning of the reading when I opened the reading this morning with a quote from Wisława Szymborska, talking about poetry as the saving banister, the banister that while you don't know exactly what poetry is and how it might help or lead or speak to you, it's something you hold on to. So this is, with thoughts of those words of Szymborska, I wrote this poem called The Banister. Also, I just suddenly realized that as an architect, designing buildings over the years, trying to get our buildings to follow the building codes, we were always having to deal with those aspects of a building which were like a banister or a handrail or ramps, which make it easier to get up and down for folks that are experiencing disability. So I think I had some emotional connection to this before I even realized it was a metaphor for poetry. So The Banister for Wisława Szymborska. I used to run my hand along it lightly, barely touching. Was it even there? Now, waking early, reaching for it in the dark, I grab hard, praise the oak from which it came, its smooth and varnished self. Easing my way down as, with all of me, I lean into the day to listen for the groan of bolt to stud, to know that very spot where it will sound. I'm going to end with a poem which isn't finished yet. I thought that might be of interest to, since that seems to be one of the plights of writing poetry, is you come up with ideas and you start sketches, and I rarely finish a poem quickly. It takes me months, weeks, years. So there's many things that are in progress, and I think it's sometimes interesting to explore them and understand why they feel unfinished. And this is a poem called What Time Is. At least that's what I'm calling it now. I think in the draft that I submitted to the forum to be printed and put in front of you all, it had a different title. But it's an exploration, I guess, at its root of trying to understand this very confusing thing of what is time, both in the sense of how do poets understand it or have understood it, but also what fascinates me, and I'm always trying to understand it. What are physicists? Particularly the physicists that study the stars and gravity and the Big Bang and all that kind of stuff. What have they understood about time? So this is called What Time Is, and its dedication is to Du Fu and Albert Einstein. So I have to explain. Du Fu, of course, is the famous Chinese poet from the Tang Dynasty period around the 7th century AD in China, perhaps the most famous poet of that period. And of course, Albert Einstein is the great scientist of relativity theory and his equation, which we all know and do not understand, is E equals mc squared. What time is for Du Fu and Albert Einstein. When we speed up, as in a flash, Albert, you saw, time slows. It's what Du Fu you discovered considering the moon. The speed of light requires night. I stare too, same moon, same light, and see, we're like stones dropped into a well, the deep black well of time. Those at the top, listening for us to splash, There are dead, To them, waiting, the well seems bottomless. We're taking forever, they think, to fall, but to us falling, no. I don't know. I think this poem wants to say, don't know yet. Will we, the living, ever know what time is? Reading that to you today in this latest version, I'm hearing the words of Szymborska too, echoed in this poem. I don't know yet. Anyway, that's all I've got for this morning. So, Sophia, you have some questions from possibly some chat from the listeners?
Yes, I do. Wow, you've given us so much enlightened poetry to consider this morning. I'm just so grateful. And now, with this last poem you gave us, we have the opportunity to help you finish a poem. So if anyone has any thoughts for what they want the ending of On Not Knowing What Time Is to be, you can put them in the chat too. When you were reading your poem, The Banister, it reminded me of the Langston Hughes poem that says, life ain't been no crystal stair. And it talks about like the struggle of going up the staircase. And I think those poems just work beautifully together because you lean on the banister of poetry to help you get through the day, to really lean in and listen. I just wanted to know and kick off the Q&A with, how did you first discover the banister of poetry? What made you write your first poem? What inspired you?
Oh gosh. Well, I have to think back. I actually began writing poetry, I guess, or tried to anyway, in high school when I was a kid, an adolescent. I read Robert Frost and Rudyard Kipling and a little bit of Shakespeare in school. And I was haunted by the music of it. I like to be able to learn things by heart and say them out loud if I thought it was the appropriate moment. I thought that was really cool. And I started trying to write poetry in my early 20s, but as I studied architecture, I got the feeling, there's a famous quote by the American poet William Carlos Williams where he says, no ideas, but in things. And he was trying to get American poets to stop being so abstract with their language and to try to use language that spoke more directly of the things themselves of this world and let them be the symbols and metaphors and so on. And I took that experience, that phrase of Williams very seriously as I began to feel that the making buildings was deeper than poetry. It was like a continuation of what I was fascinated by poetry, but it was doing it in a way that was more profound. It felt to me at the time. So I gradually gave it up and began to focus on designing buildings and what they meant to the folks who used them, to the folks who were for whom they became part of the community, homes and public buildings, and that was a mysterious feeling about the making of buildings, and that lasted for 30, 40 years, and then. Like I've often said, like an old girlfriend, poetry emerged in my life again. I had been reading it continuously growing up and becoming an adult, but I didn't really start reading it again until my wife and I were going to Italy to take the ashes of her beloved stepmother back to the village she was from. And we were going to place them in a river there. And I was keeping notes on that trip and a journal. And when my wife was reading it, when we came back, she noticed that I was breaking the lines. She said, "You're writing poems here." And I looked at it and I said, I think that's right. I was trying to find something through the language. And that's usually what I think of as the tipping point for getting me back into poetry, more or less in my 50s.
That's really cool. Yeah. Um,
And for a few years, both architecture and poetry coexisted together. But in my mid 60s, I retired from my firm, my architecture office, and began to concentrate entirely on poetry.
yeah, your relationship with these two, I guess, professions in your life is very symbiotic in a mutualist way. Uh, it seems that your poetry, when it came back to you, did it influence your architecture in any way?
Well, I was at the tail end of being an architect when as I wrote more. So I can't say directly, but I guess I would say the ability to try to speak to what mattered. Well, I mean, like the simple thing like the banister.
Yeah.
A lot of experiences in trying to be an architect and make something work for people. And these buildings are things that fundamentally don't speak. They're silent, right? But they speak in the language of things, the banister, the thing you hold on to.
Well, when you're designing something, you have to think about functionality or whether it just serves a decorative purpose. And a lot of poetry has a form that serves it and it contains the poem. But then once you have that solid foundation, you can bring in the crazy designs and the crazy decoration that you want to add to it. And I think it's really fitting that you kind of had this epiphany in Italy. Something I find really cool about Italian and specifically talking about poetry is that the word stanza, which we typically think of as like a container in poetry for different paragraphs and line breaks, that means room in Italian. So
Yeah,
you're literally creating room for your words. You're designing your poems just as you design houses as an architect.
absolutely.
We have a question from the audience that asks, was there a particular poem you felt especially connected to while reading, and why?
Today.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess maybe because it's unfinished. Reading the last poem today made me feel while I'm in the middle of trying to understand it. What is it about? And trying to bring that feeling through and to see where it might go. So I don't know. I mean, sometimes the earlier ones that I've read many times, like Any Old Wolf, feel like a little like rote, although they still intrigue me to hear. And I sometimes change the language as I'm reading. But the last one I think got under my skin the most because I still wonder. It's such a fundamental mystery to me, and both the poems of Du Fu, the Chinese poet I spoke of, who tried to, in one of his poems, tries to imagine that the same moonlight that's shining on him is shining on a dear friend who's 1,000 miles away. The same light, experience of time and light, in possibly ways that are similar to what scientists now think of as the way that light and time and space are one thing. I'll never solve it, but it remains a puzzle that I try to find a way into through poetry.
That reminds me of something you said earlier during the reading when you were reading your poem Coral, about the music of the poetry and how you just leaned into your intuition about the ending of how everything is on fire. I'm wondering, when you're writing this, when you're trying to tighten up this last poem, the unfinished poem, will you just lean into your sensibility of the right ending, even if it doesn't feel intellectually finished, but the feeling is there, the music is there?
I hope so. That's always my hope. I tend to be, as a poet, the criticism for me is I get too brainy. I get too lost in the abstractions and trying to solve, puzzles to myself rather than listening for the music and trying to go with that. So that really matters to me. And
a lot of your poems also had epigrams and dedications, especially your earlier poems about the story of your childhood and your family's immigration to the US. So what do you think is the role of poetry in preserving history and memory and the immigration story? And what's your hope for that poem with your grandchildren?
Well, let me first remind myself of something I think I said to you, Sophia. Um, when you were in high school and writing that poem that won the award, that the contest I was helping to direct was put out across the country. Poetry is one great conversation. And I've often tried to attribute that. I heard it attributed once to the great Russian poet Anna Akhmatova. And I'm not sure if the pronunciation is Akhmatova or Akhmatova. Your listeners can help me, perhaps. I've never been able to find, I've heard that attributed to her, never found it in her writing, poetry, which I adore. But that seems to me to capture the what is important in your question to me, that you're participating in a conversation, and whether you even are directly responding or not, as often I am. With the Szymborska song and Miłosz and so on, where you're responding to a poem that's also already written. Always, I think you're responding to the tradition of poetry, which has arrived at your doorstep. Is something you take in through the poets you read and the words that matter to you, and you try to find your way in that, expanding on it, extending it, taking it places that you think it hasn't ever gone, and then you find some other poet and you think, oh my God, he's light years beyond anything I've ever done, et cetera, et cetera. So it's being in that mix, which I think is the key to me. So it's a conversation which in times of trouble, you want to keep going because it speaks so deeply to the cultural life of a country, its ability to survive political upheaval, and so on. So you want to keep that conversation alive. And that's been important to me. As far as the grandkids, of course, who knows? Who knows who your grandkids are in truth? That opening poem in the matter of paternity sort of speaks to that. Who are the sons and who are the daughters? We don't know. We know who our biological ones are. We hope, and we're sometimes lucky in that regard. But the children of our poems and the fathers and mothers that birthed us as artists, we have inklings of, but never entirely understand, I don't think. I told you before we went on that I've been reading the Divine Comedy carefully in the last few years and finding in it something which is ineffably wonderful and has inspired me to write some things recently, which I had no idea I would be working on, and how that's going to fit into this conversation. Who knows? Yeah.
It was wonderful to open my inbox and see your most recent poem pop up in Vox Populi. I was also struck by what you said about the offspring that we have no idea we might have. Like, could the writer of Stardust, the 1920s song, ever imagine that one of its offsprings would be found in your poem, Stardust? I'm not sure, but that's one of the beautiful things about art. Could Matisse ever conceive of the fact that you would write a beautiful poem based off of his painting? Probably not. But as artists, we put this art out into the world and then we let go of it. And wherever it goes, wherever it takes us, is now the art's journey. And we are just witnesses to the beautiful connections it can spark.
Right. You have no idea where it's going to go, how it's going to be heard, probably, if at all, when you're long gone.
Do you think your work at 16 Rivers Press, and specifically with the Youth Poetry Project, helps continue the great conversation of poetry?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's been both the hope and the experience I've had. I could say to your listeners, we've been running some projects for young teen writers around the country, and then publishing the results of those in chapbooks, encouraging readings from the young poets, as young as seventh graders, who are early teens, who are writing poems against a curriculum about climate change, as they begin to learn what that is, what it means, both the science of it and the way it's going to affect their everyday lives. We decided to incorporate poetry into that, because there's so many what are sometimes called poems that have been written by poets trying to address the same questions and uncertainties, and cope with feelings about that kind of stuff. And we gave that material along with the science to the seventh graders and had them write poems. And we've published 3 chapbooks of seventh graders writing in response to what they understand gradually to be the experience of climate change on the planet Earth.
It's really moving work, especially to read their understanding of climate change and its effects. It's amazing that you're able to work with these young writers, especially as young as 7th grade. And we have one more question from the audience that asks about the themes of your writing. Are there themes that you find yourself returning to again and again in your poetic practice?
Yes. I don't always know what they are until I reread the work and try to see what was I thinking then. But I guess as I said a couple of times in the reading, I guess the overall theme for me now is late years and the mysteries of that are presented by our mortality, by the questions that raises, the experience of longing for things that are past, memory. All of that seems to find a place. And then I guess woven into that is the experience that I and many have had, where having had roots, my father's roots, his father's roots, in a traditional religion that's no longer, I would say, to put it bluntly, that no longer really deeply matters to me. I guess in that sense, I would say I'm a secular man, but I'm really not, because there's some way in which that material is still alive in me. Where do we get the idea of hope? Where do we get the idea of faith in something coming to be? What do we imagine happens after death? Blah, blah, blah. Imagination seems so vital, and it's inextricably connected to religious thinking and feeling. So I find that material still finding its way into my poetry.
Yeah.
I really look for that, and I try to honor that.
In one of your first poems you read today, you talk about how song is an unruly god and how silence is also a god.
Right.
You found a religion or some sort of faith in your poetry. You listen to this music in your poetry that's inherent in it, and that's what guides you. It's kind of like an invisible god of your own making, which I think is really cool.
Thank you for being such a good listener. Yes, silence is God, but so is language, our rebel God. Trying to put into language what cannot be put into language.
The impossible work of poets. I think, unfortunately, the hour is almost up, but I just want to end the session with one last question. If anybody would like to follow along for more of your work, where can they find you? Where can they read more?
Well, the books are available from a website. I hope it's available internationally. 16 Rivers Press. 16. It's that 16 rivers are the rivers that flow into San Francisco Bay. That's the watershed of the region in which I live. And the press that I have written for is named after that watershed, effectively, 16 Rivers Press. And so that press has a website. My books can be ordered from that website. And I think from other places too, there's a distributor. If you just search on my work as an architect gets more, you find your way to it by searching online more than my poetry, so you have to keep at it. I was a part of a group that wrote a book early in my architecture years called Pattern Language, which is actually a book about architecture that tries to find its way into the poetry that's at the root of architecture. And that book is still in print and still comes up a lot when people are trying to find out about me. So keep looking and you'll find the poetry buried in there.
Great. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Thank you, Murray, for your beautiful poetry, for poetry that demands attentiveness and yearns to be listened to. Thank you for your beautiful words and your presence this morning. Thanks.
Thanks, Sophia. It's a real treat to be Q&A'd with you, who I met through poetry years ago.
Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks to all listeners who are there.